I'll say the lovely
All right, everybody, please start finding your chairs. That would be wonderful. Wow, that's actually kind of quick. It's never this quick. Before we get started, John has a couple of things.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. If you are an intern and you didn't get one of these, then Dina will come by and give you one. So raise your hand if you didn't get one of these and you're an intern. That means you didn't check in at the front desk, probably. Or they were out by the time you did check in. I want to address a concern on the learning exercise. Because the turf manual is kind of out of date, Scott and Dana went ahead and printed off some up-to-date information from one of our turf specialists, and it's really good stuff. But there's a bit of confusion over fertilization dates, and I thought I would address that slowly because I was confused when I read it the first time too. I think the key thing to think in mind is that the sheet here that's from a turf info you will find in your handouts is that this is written from a perspective of a statewide audience. And we are not a statewide audience. We're in kind of the eastern third of the state, eastern fourth of the state. It addresses sand-based systems and soil-based systems. And first of all, let me address that. Sand-based systems are like TD Ameritrade Park, where it's 95% sand, or a golf green, where it's 95% sand. Those turfs are fertilized and watered differently than the average residential home lawn or park or cemetery grounds or library. Those are different. They hold on to water less less capacity, but they drain a lot better. So it's kind of pro and con. When you manage turf at a very high level of intensity, you need a sand-based system. The ones that we deal with mostly are soil-based systems. And so we'll key on that. There's a statement here in the soil-based system that probably directly, from what I've been told, directly addressed as a question in your learning activity. And the statement is, don't apply nitrogen after mid to late October, depending on your location in Nebraska. This increases the risk of leaching, and these applications can cause excessive spring growth. Now, in the guide that Sarah Browning, your speaker this afternoon, and I wrote for lawn care in eastern Nebraska, if you look on the back side of this form that you were handed, you'll see largely the same information, but it's tailored just a tad bit more towards eastern Nebraska. And what we put in there is just another way of saying the very same thing. So in the upper left-hand corner, there's a chart that's blue and beige. Those two go together pretty well, the blue and beige. And if you look at that last entry of that chart, you will see on the left-hand side the grass species. The next one is the key, which is either a star or a square. In this case, it's a square. And then the last, then the second to last thing is timing. And under that, it says October 15th through November 5th. And that's the keyword that is used there. So the keyword that is used in this sheet is mid to late October. And considering it's all for the whole state of Nebraska, that's a pretty accurate statement because they're taking in Scottsbluff as well as Blair. Here in eastern Nebraska, we're taking in Fremont East, right? So we're a little bit more clued into waiting just a little bit longer into the month. Plus, if you did this, follow this plan and fertilized right around Labor Day, August 25th through September 5th, you probably wouldn't be ready for another application for 6 or 7 weeks afterwards. Now, what do you notice in the right-hand column of the last entry? Is that a full rate of fertilizer? No. This is about a fourth of a rate of fertilizer if it's needed. The key here is that we fertilize growing things, whether it's a vegetable or a houseplant. We don't fertilize houseplants in the wintertime generally, or not nearly as much. The same thing is true with turf. We fertilize growing things. So if we have a, quote, late fall, where we're still getting some growth and you're mowing and you're getting a little bit of growth off of it, and the turf is a little bit on the thin side, you probably want to put on about a fourth of a rate of the winterizer product. If it's looking reasonably dense, if it's healthy, there would be no reason to apply that product. So from a need standpoint, you don't need it. And this is where you will think about these systems or these approaches when you go to a garden store and you see a 4-step approach or a 5-step approach, or your clients ask you about a lawn service who has a 6-step approach or a 4-step approach. This is a question that you want to talk to them about. Does the lawn need it? Based on the density of the turf and the color of the turf and the root system of the turf. And are they going to adjust for that? That's just the advice. You don't want to tell a client, no, don't hire that lawn service. Your advice will be to clue them into timing, density of the turf, color of the turf, thickness of the root system. So do you have any questions about that or clarification? Clear? Because what was coming to me was people had all kinds of confusion. Awesome, that's great. Excellent. Second little short thing is about an opportunity for customer service client interaction training that you have later this month. Does anyone have any question about that? This is strongly encouraged for everyone, especially people who work the Hort Helpline or Ask the Master Gardener table, or really give presentations in a speaker's bureau setting or work at a demonstration garden. You're going to be interacting with the public, maybe not as much as on the Hort Helpline, but still the goal there is to interact with the public. We don't maintain gardens just to maintain gardens. We're trying to teach out of those gardens. So any questions about that? We strongly encourage you there are 3 opportunities. May 23rd, March, they both start with M. But the last official training session will be integrated pest management. Dr. Larry Schultz will be here to present that, and he usually presents about a 5.5, 6 hour training, and then there'll be about an hour and a half after that. So that'll be the first session. The following Monday, we'll have 2 opportunities, one at 9 o'clock and one at 1 o'clock, because people are kind of used to coming at 9 o'clock and 1 o'clock. Any questions about that? I'll be hanging out the back if you have any questions. We'd really like you to attend one of those sessions. Okay, over to Scott.
All right, housekeeping, make sure that your cell phones are on vibrate or silent, and if you need to take a call, we do appreciate you go out to the hallway. We are now up to a Happy Meal. Emergency exits are along the west wall. If we need to evacuate quickly, if there is a tornado, we go down the hallway by the bathrooms. there are bathrooms in the back of room C, down the hallway, blah, blah, blah. Emergency contact cards if you need to update. If you added a spouse, Chuck went away. You have those emergency contact cards. We'd appreciate them updated. And today's classes are not offered for ISA or NAACEU, so they are not being, you will not need to sign up for anything if you're an arborist. Directories, if you have not picked up your directories, we have them back in the back where you sign up. Returning master gardeners, it'd be great if you could pick those up. There's been a lot of phone calls about the Gretna weather station. It has been retired. But the good news is that the master gardener weather station here does monitor the soil temperature. So when we are getting those phone calls, please refer clients to MG extension WX, all one word, MG extension WX.com. All right, without further ado, Mr. John Porter will be teaching everything about vegetable gardening today. So please welcome John.
Everything. I'm teaching everything. So get ready, hold on, strap down. So he said to silence your cell phone. I will actually ask you to take them out in a moment if you have one. If you don't, that is fine. To make sure they're silenced, but we're going to do an activity first. However, spring is almost here, right? Right. So if you've been one of those people that come in and help with the calls at the office, you know that they're starting to come in. We're very glad. So that's one of the signs of spring. Another sign is all those calls are about brown marmorated stink bugs, right? So that's one of the signs of spring. Time changes this weekend. That's one of the signs of spring. And also, we had our planning meeting for the upcoming season of Backyard Farmer, which starts in just a few weeks. So that is the final sign of spring, right? Right. So we will be having that first week of April. So if you have your electronic device of any type connected in any way to the great interwebs, pull it out. And you will have something pop up on the screen here. Go to the website slido.com, SLIDO.com. Slido.com. And once you get there, it'll ask you to enter a code. The code is DSMG. I've tried to make it easy to remember. And it will ask you a question. It's sort of the starter question, so you can figure out if you can use this thing or not. It's, what is your favorite vegetable to grow? The first one is a tomato, doesn't surprise me. Tomato keeps getting bigger. Zucchini. Someone's a glutton for punishment. Peppers, carrots, okra, asparagus. Pumpkins, tomatoes, more tomatoes. So this is our practice. I see we have about 36 answers so far, so I'll give you a few more seconds so we can test out, and then we'll move on to the next question, which is a real question. Poblano peppers, that's one of my favorites. I grow poblanos every year. Green beans, Brussels sprouts, radishes, eggplant. See, we have a little bit of everything there, so I'm going to give you 10 more seconds to answer your question. And then it'll move on to the next one. It's still tomato, number one. There we go. That does not surprise me, right? You know, I did, last year on Backyard Farmer, the segments I did were all about tomatoes, and so now I'm the tomato guy, right? Though I have to let audiences in on a little bit of a secret. I don't like tomatoes. I cook with them, I can with them, but I don't eat them raw. I don't like raw tomatoes.
What is your favorite vegetable?
What's my favorite vegetable? To grow or to eat?
Both.
Both? Well, I love Brussels sprouts. But Brussels sprouts are hard to grow. So favorite to grow, I would say poblano peppers. Okay. Now, what is your biggest struggle in vegetable gardening? Is it growing a certain thing? Is it growing a certain way? Is it a certain pest? I can't help you with time. So pests, weeds, space, watering, how much to water, moles, rabbits. Lots of problems on there. So luckily this afternoon, Sarah is going to cover diseases and insects. So we got a whole afternoon of that. But we can work in some of these other things, and remind me if I don't help you in this talk. If you still have questions, you can always ask them at the end. Cucumber beetles, timing of planting, we're going to work on that one. Squash bugs, crop rotation, okay. And I have one last one here at the beginning, and then we'll move on to the presentation, and then you'll see this again at the end. And that is, what is something that you'd like to learn about? It could be about one of your problems, it could be about something else. What do you want to learn? How to garden without sun? So I see companion planting on there. We might talk about companion planting, but you're not going to like what I have to say. Okay, that will stay up as we continue to go, but we will pop back over to the presentation, I believe. Turn that off. Okay, everything. You want to learn everything. Well, you're in luck. Okay. So as I was putting this talk together, there are basically some things to know up front whenever you're getting ready to plant a garden or whenever you're getting ready to develop a garden, and then there are things that we talk about management-wise after that. So we'll sort of start talking about the things that you should think about whenever you're starting a new garden. And as I got to putting this together, all the words I found started with S, so I made up something new. I don't know if it'll catch on, but it's the 5S gardening plan. So site selection, soil and fertility, selecting plants, scheduling, and sources. So we'll talk about those things, and then we'll talk about some more things outside of that as time permits. So when we're talking about site selection, some of the things that you mentioned in that little poll that I did about sun, about water, about those kinds of things can play into site selection. So that's a good place to start as we're talking about a garden. So you want to make sure that the site that you're picking is suitable for a garden. And what does that mean? You want to make sure that it fits the space. So do you have enough room to actually grow stuff? Is it accessible? So this is not as much of an issue if, let's say, you have a very small lot, but I talk to people that have an acreage and they put their vegetable garden on the back 40, right? And then it's like they wonder why nothing ever grows well because they go visit it once a week, And so also talking about accessibility is, do you have any mobility limitations that you need to worry about? Whenever, and especially if you're helping maybe an organization or as part of a Master Gardener project, you're designing a garden space, you think about accessibility. So is that raised beds? We can talk about raised beds, and they raise the level of the soil so it's easier, people don't have to bend as far. Is it pathways? So if you have a pathway and you know that you have trouble walking, on uneven pathways? What do you use to make sure that those pathways are walkable? You make sure that it meets the gardener's needs. Does it produce enough? Does it meet the needs? So if I'm wanting to produce tomatoes, that's all I want to grow, and I find the shadiest part of my garden, that's probably not going to work. And we'll talk about sun and plants. Because we need to make sure it has adequate light and has access to water. So this may not be an issue if you're gardening at home. Typically, people will have some sort of outside water source that they can use for gardening. But sometimes you might be asked to help with a garden project. A lot of times I work with people that, most people don't realize that the city of Omaha has a program. They've identified vacant lots throughout the city that they will allow people to vegetable garden on for free. You go to the city planning office, you pick out a lot, you sign a paper, and you have the use of it for the season. It's a vacant lot. What probably isn't on that vacant lot? Water. So some of the groups, I work with some refugee groups, like how do we make sure that they have access to water? One of them is very successful. The fire department is down the road. And so they have like some big tanks, and the fire department comes every once in a while and fills them up with water. We don't have that luxury. What do you do? So for some of them, it's been a failure because they could never identify a water source. One of the options that has been presented has been, oh, well, the water company will come out and put in a line for you, or will connect you. So you can actually get a faucet that connects to a fire hydrant.
For free?
It's not for free. Number one, you have to pay the water bill, so whatever you use, and it can be several $1,000s to get that set up. Right? So thinking about that access might not be as simple as you think. So that's something we have to think about. So we had the question about light. What can I grow? I don't have any sun. I guess I can't vegetable garden. That necessarily isn't the case. When we look at fruits and vegetables that we grow, there's a very, very loose way to think about it. I wouldn't, we never say it's absolute. But typically, if you grow it for the fruit or the root, you need full sun. If you grow it for the leaves or the stems, partial shade is all you need. So what does that actually mean? Full sun means 6+ hours of light a day. At least 6 hours of full sunlight. If you don't have at least 6 hours of full sunlight, that means that you're not going to be able to grow the things that produce fruit. So here's a good botany lesson. You've had botany, right? You know what botany? Okay. What are the things that we grow in the vegetable garden that are actually fruits? Tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, cucumbers, melons. Any more? Beans, peas. If it has a seed, it's a fruit. So if it has a seed, you need at least 6 hours of light to grow it. Corn. If you're growing it for the leaves or the stems, then you can get by with less than 6 hours. You still need some sun. You're not going to like grow this, in the bottom of a cave, if you have if you're a cave dweller, but you can get by with less sunlight. So what are the things that we grow for leaves? Lettuce, spinach, greens, marijuana. There's always one in the crowd. Right, onions and beets, they're also root crops.
But there's still people want the green part.
Right, the green part. So sometimes you can get by without less sun. Yes?
When you say 6 hours, does that have to be consecutive? No.
It doesn't have to be consecutive.
No.
So if you get some bright morning sun and then some afternoon sun, that's fine. As long as there's 6 hours within the day, you typically are okay. You'll find that plants are not picky. In botany, you might have learned about photoperiod, about plants that they have to have a certain amount of light in order to flower. It's actually the amount of darkness. And it's really interesting because if that darkness is interrupted, even by a short burst of light, like 10 seconds in the middle of the night, it will offset blooming. That's like a weird thing. The light, so it's not the light that matters. It doesn't have to be continuous. It's the dark for the flowering that matters.
Like Christmas cactus.
Yeah, like the Thanksgiving and Christmas cactus or poinsettia. So when they're going in to initiate flowering, they need that like 12 to 16 hours of continuous darkness in order to set flowers for like 2 or 3 weeks. And if they get a flash of light in the middle of the night, it upsets them. So it's not the light that has to be continuous, it's the dark for those things.
Does the street light that may shine on your garden affect the flowers?
Does the street light, so you will get some light from auxiliary sources. So, you know, that will provide a little bit. The street light is not very bright. That doesn't provide, you know, like the full sunshine, but it will provide a small amount of light. Well, I went on my good friend Google, and we had a chat, and I found this little graphic for 15 things that you can plant in the shade. And I got to looking at that, and you notice that I put some X's on there. But you can't believe everything Google tells you, right? If you haven't learned that by now, we haven't taught you anything. We have a lot of the leafy greens on there, bok choy, chard, spinach, but they put on some of the leaf or the root plants like garlic and beets and carrots. Those things do need more sunlight. But if you have someone that says, I have all shade, what can I grow as a vegetable? You're going to steer them away from the tomatoes. Everyone wants to grow a tomato. It's sort of like pathologic. Everyone has to grow a tomato. If you don't grow a tomato, you're not a gardener. Now we can talk about, whenever we're putting the site together, how are we actually going to grow? And we have different ways that we can do that, and they have different pros and cons. The most common that we see are in-ground or with rows. That is the traditional, oh, I have my, my 40 by 40 garden, and I get out the tiller every year, and I till it up, and I plant everything in rows. So that is probably the least infrastructure that you have, but it can be more difficult to maintain than some of the other methods of gardening because of the way that we do spacing and the way that we manage weeds. Because when you open up that whole soil bed, then you have that whole soil area to manage for weeds. We also are trying to get people to go away from tillage. One of the things that we've been really focused on is trying to reduce tillage of soil, because I know old-time farmers, they would be very proud, like, I went out there and I took the tractor through the production area and my soil is like baby powder. Right? Like, that's how I know I made my soil good.
Right.
That actually destroys the soil structure. It actually creates more problems than it solves. So it might make it easier at the beginning, but it makes it difficult to manage soil and bad for soil health overall, because it actually reduces all the pore spaces in the soil where all the good bacteria and fungi live. So you can get all those things out. It actually breaks down the organic matter faster. If you're adding compost or something like that as organic matter, the tilling that you do is actually like turning compost, and it speeds up the process, so it breaks down the organic matter faster, and it actually leaves the system faster. We try to encourage people to do less tilling, and one of those methods is by not tilling up the big area, but maybe doing smaller beds. We can do beds, and we can do raised beds. It doesn't have to be a raised bed whenever you're gardening. And that's something that I think we sort of went too far in one direction. It's like, oh, I'm going to start a garden. I'm going to build raised beds. We need more tables. where, you know, we have people shoved in the bathroom right now. We'll let them out. Whenever we put our gardens together, I have a hand right here. Whenever we put our gardens together, we don't necessarily have to build raised beds. You can still garden in beds and just have strips of, say, a walkway. So do wood chip walkways between the beds, or even a planted walkway. So you can leave it grass and mow it. I've seen people that kill out the grass and do maybe just like a white clover or some sort of clover that's low and doesn't need mowed. You don't have to do the raised beds. You can still do beds. So probably one of the most well-known vegetable gardens in the world does it this way. I had the great opportunity once in my life to go and teach a gardening workshop at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in the vegetable garden. It helps that a college friend worked at Monticello, and every fall they do this big, they call it the Heritage Harvest Festival, and it's like thousands and thousands of people at Monticello, all learning about gardening and homesteading type stuff. So I went and I had my pop-up tent in Jefferson's vegetable garden, and you look around, and there may be like 4 or 5 foot wide beds that are maybe 20 feet long, and they have about a foot or 2 feet of walkway between them that is grass, and they just mow it. That is their garden system. So if you ever go to Monticello, you can go and see the gardens. It's on a terrace, like on the hillside, and then he has this there was a little pergola built. That was his like meditation space. He would just like go there to look out over the mountains and meditate. It gives us a little easier access so that we don't have to walk through the soil whenever we're harvesting or working in the garden, and that can actually be helpful for the soil structure. If you till up the soil, then walk on it, it compacts it. If we can just have those walkways, that's much better. It also lets us do what's called intensive spacing, so we can actually get stuff much closer together. You know, if you look on the back of a seed packet, it'll say, okay, plant this 18 inches apart in the row, and then 3 feet between the row. So there's a lot of space that one plant takes up. If we do it in beds, we remove that between the row spacing, and we plant it just those, like it would be 18 inches apart in all directions. So you can save space by doing that as well. And then maybe you don't have a garden, or you can't go out and work in a garden. There's containers that you can do, container gardening. You can grow all kinds of vegetables in containers. If you were here last spring when we did the last raffle thing, that was the workshop I did, was vegetables in containers, talking about some of the, a lot of the leafy greens and lettuces and stuff you can grow, but you can also grow tomatoes and peppers and all that kind of stuff in containers. And so there's those 3 major options for people to start or to design their vegetable garden space. Now, when we talk about fertility, here's one of the things that we have to think about, is that vegetables are managed differently than turf, and they're managed differently than ornamentals. If you have someone teaching you about fertility for, say, trees and shrubs, it's much less intense. And here's the reason. You have to remember that whenever you harvest or whenever you're removing plants, so we're in the vegetable garden, we plant the plant, it grows. At the end of the season, we usually remove it unless we're growing something like an asparagus or a rhubarb or something like that. Plus, all the stuff that we harvest, all of that has nutrients that we are removing. So think of it as you're making a deposit of fertility, you're removing some of it as edible, and you're removing some of it as residue that hopefully you put back in compost and then return to the garden. But you have an intense use of fertility. The way that you can help manage that is to test soil regularly. So I would say in the beginning, when you start, you test the soil, and then maybe every few years thereafter. Because there are some assumptions that we can make regarding fertility that are the same for other plants. So number 1 is that phosphorus and potassium are typically longer lasting in the soil. And we put enough in there that will last a few years. So they are more likely to stick around in the soil than nitrogen. Nitrogen lasts a much shorter time in the soil. And so we have to replace that on a more regular basis. Also, testing for nitrogen can sometimes be cost prohibitive. So if you do a soil test, 9 times out of 10, it's not going to have nitrogen listed. You basically just have to make an assumption for nitrogen. And sometimes, we can give you a number, but a lot of times it's looking at how things are growing in your garden as to how you make these decisions. You want to amend the soil based only on the soil test. So if you need to add a commercial fertilizer, you do that. If you want to do compost, manure, something like that, you can also estimate that. You can find like general numbers for some of those soil amendments, and I think I have some later in this talk about that. And using the organic matter is not just for fertility, it's for soil structure as well. So compost, manures, other organic materials can really help with the soil structure. So you may ask, you don't want me to till the soil, how do I add compost to the soil? Well, there's been some research done lately that looks at what happens if you just add the compost to the top layer of the soil. So over time, especially here where we have winter, freezing and thawing, and also the precipitation that we get really helps get that organic matter down through the soil without tilling. So one of the recommendations we're making is to actually top dress. Just add it to the top.
Would that be better to add the compost in the fall after you clean off your garden then, so they've got the roots and the dry action?
It will, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute. So there's another reason too we're going to talk about. Whenever we have this organic matter, then it can work down through the soil. Now, whenever you're starting a new garden, you might have said, well, you don't want me to till up. How do I make a new bed if I can't till up? So one of the methods that some people are recommending is if you have organic matter, to actually cut the grass or weeds or whatever as low as possible, even kill them out, using some sort of herbicide if you want to, and then pile up as much organic matter as you can on top, like a few inches. Even if you have time, we know that people really plan ahead, years down the road when they want a garden, right? I know all of you. It's like, I'm going to build a garden. I'm going to Lowe's today and we're building it tomorrow, right? That's how we garden. If you plan ahead, if you identify those garden beds that you want, like a year in advance, pile up like wood mulch, wood chips, something like that, up to a foot. Let it break down over the year, and next year you'll have a garden bed. That's one technique. You can, so you got to figure out what works for you. Maybe it's, the only way you have is tillage. Try to reduce that as much as possible.
John,
Yes, ma'am.
what about putting some cloth, not cloth, but garden cloth down over the winter? No. Paper.
No, so the cloth, we find causes more problems than it fixes. It's there. Stuff will still grow through it, especially if like weed seeds land on it. And if you've never tried to pull a weed up through the cloth, it'll break down and go into little shreds.
But what I'm asking is to start a new bed, if you do this over the winter, then pull it off in the spring, and you've killed out what's laying.
You could try that. Maybe I would do like a plastic so it can solarize it a little bit and kill out stuff. So that you can do that. You could try that as well. So those are some different techniques that you can think about whenever you're starting a new garden or when you're amending soil. We don't have to think about pH as much here. So if I were to go outside anywhere that we haven't gardened before to the native virgin soil and take a soil test, what would the average soil pH be out there?
7.5.
7, 7.5, around here. 8, so 7, 7.5 up to 8. So it turns out that that's about the right range for most vegetables that we would grow. The reason being is that not necessarily that the plants love acidic or basic soil, but when we look at the actual soil, we see that the other nutrients are tied, so they bind to the soil particles and to other chemicals. And whenever the pH is in that neutral range, they release and they're available to the plant. We see on this scale on the right, like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, the band is the thickest when we're in that neutral range. Now, you might have picked up, whether you know my history or not, that I am not from around here. I am from West Virginia. Much different soil. If I were to go in my front yard back in West Virginia and take a soil test, the pH would be 5.5. So there are some positives to that, and we just had one. I'll repeat that in a minute. But whenever you're growing a vegetable garden, you have to amend the pH where I'm from in order. You can put all the fertilizer you want on there, but it's never going to help the plants because it doesn't become available to the plants. You can see down here on the left side of that range, I don't even think this thing works anymore. It doesn't. On the left side, the taper down, they're not available to the plants. However, on the bottom, you see iron, manganese, boron, copper, and zinc. There are plants that are heavy feeders on those things, and they grow much better at lower pHs. It took me a while to realize that when I moved here that I would no longer be able to go in my front yard and plop down a blueberry plant and have it thrive. Like blueberries, azaleas, rhododendrons, all those things actually grow wild in West Virginia. You can go up to the forest and they're out there. The state flower is a rhododendron. Right? So, oh well, we got no mountains, no blueberries. When we were talking about reducing tillage, here are some of those reasons that I talked about. Whenever we're not tilled, we have the nice organic layer that forms naturally, and especially if we amend that. Then we also have the water that goes down through, and it percolates into the ground and doesn't run off and flood. We have lots of flood issues here, and some of that is contributed by the runoff that we get from fields. It provides the natural ecosystem for all of the bacteria and fungi. They thrive there. Whenever we till, what actually happens is we, over the short term, increase the microbial activity. So they like really ramp up. They really eat the organic matter. They release carbon dioxide in large amounts, and then they die off. We also have water runoff, because what happens is when we run the tiller through the garden, when the tines hit the bottom of the soil, it actually pushes it down, and it's sort of like kneading a biscuit or something. Like it pushes that down and makes it more compact below. So there's a hard pan level made below where you've tilled, and so water runs off instead of percolates through the ground. There's another reason that we want you to test your soil, especially if you're in an urban area, and that is for safety reasons. This is something that we probably haven't thought about a lot, but it's something that we should be concerned with, especially in certain parts of Omaha, and that is contamination by lead and heavy metals. You may know that certain parts of Omaha, there was a manufacturing plant that released large amounts of lead. Are we okay? Okay, we're good. We release large amounts of lead into the soil, so we have that to concern about. Even if we didn't have that, there are some issues, especially in concentrated urban areas, that could have led to soil contamination. Number one, what did we paint our houses with? Lead paint. What did we put in our gasoline? Lead. What do we have in our plumbing pipes? Lead. We might have figured out that that wasn't the best thing to do, right? If we had a house that had lead paint on it and all the paint sloughed off into the soil, it could be a contamination issue. If we have old pipes laying around, it could be a contamination issue. And if you, probably we don't qualify for this, but if you're in a really concentrated urban area back in when we had leaded gasoline, if you had lots of traffic, the lead was in the exhaust. It doesn't go anywhere because it's so heavy. So when it rains, it washes it out of the air into the soil. Plus any previous use, so that industrial use. Around that industrial use in Omaha, that was an EPA Superfund cleanup site, a brownfield site. There was an amount of mitigation that they had to do. You can still go online, you can look up the Omaha lead map, where they tested lots and see if, especially if you're in the eastern part of Omaha, to see, was there lead in my soil? Did they test? And you can actually see yes or no. When I moved here 3 years ago, someone told me you need to check the lead registry. I went online, my soil was tested. Was it positive? Yes. What did they do? For my lot, we were lucky. They actually completely scraped and repainted the house. They removed the top 6 inches of topsoil and removed it and replaced it.
How close was your house to that charcoal plant?
So I don't even remember where that was because I wasn't. Because I am at like the 24th and Woolworth area, so around Leavenworth.
South.
It's a little south, but we were still contaminated. Like there's a big swath of East Omaha that was contaminated. Okay. So you want to test, you can contact Midwest Labs. They will test garden soil for heavy metal. I think it's about $35. If someone is starting a vegetable garden, especially on a vacant lot, a new lot, or they know that there was contamination before, you want to do that. However, there are some ways to mitigate that as well. The health department also has a record of this. So right after we moved in, they sent us a letter about lead contamination. They came and tested the house. We actually did have one test that came back positive in the house. And they gave us this big honking huge vacuum cleaner with a HEPA filter on it. It's like, you can't even move the thing. So we like rolled it up to the attic, like it lives up there now. And because it has to stay with the house. If we ever move, we have to leave this vacuum cleaner behind, right? The major risk is not from actually the plant uptaking the lead. It is from the residue on the plant. If you have dirt on the plant, if you have a root crop that you have soil on, then that is where the risk of contamination comes from. So you can mitigate that. Growing in raised beds is one way, so that you're not growing in the native soil, making sure everything is washed. Also, there are only certain classes of people that are affected heavily by lead. You know, it's usually younger people. It's a developmental thing for brain development. And so thinking about that can be important. So if you have the notes, printed them off, there's a link at the bottom that I created that goes to this EPA document that is the growing gardens in urban soils, and it talks about that as well. So what do we do when we select new plants for the garden? So what can we pick out? Well, we want us to grow things that fit our needs. Like I said, my little secret, I don't like raw tomatoes. Am I going to grow tomatoes that you primarily eat raw?
No.
No, I don't grow slicing tomatoes. I still grow Roma tomatoes because I do canning with them. I still grow some cherry tomatoes for other uses. I cook with tomatoes, but I wouldn't, grow a tomato to slice up to put on a sandwich. the plant should be able to grow in the area. You should be able to know what is hardy and isn't hardy. You look at the seed packet and you look at the USDA hardiness zone. Does anyone know what our hardiness zone here is? 5. Right, so don't try to sneak in a 6 or a 7, right? Sometimes we may have clients that ask about that stuff. They see something online and I want to grow that. Can I grow it here? You know, you have to tell them no. I work with different groups of refugees, and some of the plants that they grew back in their home country, they've asked, like, can we grow this here? Like, no, we can't grow that here. Like, so we figure out what we can and can't grow. I saw a hand over here.
Do they still say like zone A and B?
There is zone A and B. And the way it works is zone A is the colder part. Zone B is the warmer part. And so you can look at that because the way it goes is it goes from 1 to like 12, and then it goes 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B. And so it's the warmer. So I think we are here in Omaha, we are 5B. A little further out is 5A, and then there are some 4s in the zones. That's another thing that I had to give up when I moved because all my life we were zone 6, but right before I moved, they released the new USDA zone map. And my little area that I lived along the river back in West Virginia was zone 7. Like, I already had like some pomegranate bushes in my shopping cart, you know, to purchase, so. Yes, ma'am.
Something else I noticed in the seed catalogs was that they'll say things are hardy, and then in the small print description, it'll say must be lifted in winter.
Right, so you have to watch out for that. So hardy doesn't always mean winter hardy. You have to do certain things. Also, when we talk about like starting seeds and planting things, we talk about the last average frost date. What is the last average frost date?
Mother's Day.
I've got Mother's Day. Someone always says Mother's Day. May 10th. Okay. It depends on the language that we use. If you say last frost date and last average frost date, a lot of times we use last average frost date. So if you know anything about, you know, I'm in grad school, I'm taking statistics this semester, right? So we're talking about average. So average is sort of like the middle, right? So average is like when the chance is 50-50. So there's like a 50% chance of frost, a 50% chance that it's not going to frost. And if you go to the National Weather Service webpage, they have different charts, and they chart it out. There's a 10% column, a 50% column, and a 90% column on last frost temperatures.
Isn't there the median instead of the average?
So there's the median,
That's the middle.
right, the very middle score. The average is sort of like if you add everything up together and divide it by the number, and they look at, so it's an average of the last 30 years whenever they do the test. They do it every 10 years, so there might be new numbers that come out this year. But they average the last 30 years. They look at the last date of the frost. And what they did is they calculated the 3 numbers. We don't really care about the 10 because we're not going to grow anything there. The average date, the 50-50 date, is April 20th. So that's when you have a 50-50 chance. So it depends on how well you like to play the lottery, right? That is the date where the probability of frost starts to be less than 50%. So every day after that, the chances go down. The 90% is that May 10th date. So if you said average last frost date, you could go a little bit earlier. Depends on the semantics, I guess. There we go. And the microclimate. So if you have a good microclimate in your area where it's a little bit warmer, you could get by with that little bit earlier date. The plants, we should look for disease resistance. So that's especially key in vegetable gardens whenever we have high turnover. Unfortunately, when we talk about plant selection, we're going to be talking about heirlooms are very popular, but they're older plants that didn't have disease resistance bred into them. A lot of the new cultivars do have disease resistance bred into them. And then we want to look for growing guides for assistance as potential sources for information. So looking at those temperatures, if we have someone that says, well, I want to grow lettuce, are you going to tell them that they have to wait until May 10th to plant lettuce?
No.
No, because we'll talk about different timing of crops and cool season crops. So you can plant some stuff earlier than those dates. But a lot of like lay gardeners don't know that. They think you go out and you plant everything at once. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. Whenever we're planning or scheduling our harvests, we want to talk about planting for multiple harvests. Most gardeners are really bad about this. They will go out and they will plant all of one thing all at once. They will go out and, okay, I'm going to grow carrots this year. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to sow all of my carrots. I planted all of my carrots, and all 200 of them are ready at the same time, right? We want to actually do something called like relay planting or planting, doing our schedule where we actually have stuff that is maturing throughout the garden season. And so some of that is relay planting, where we will have multiple planting dates, maybe a week or two apart. Some of that can be from crop selection. Maybe if we look at tomatoes, I want to plant, 2 or 3 tomato plants of different varieties. Some of them will mature at 80 days, some of them will mature at 100 days. And that is like a natural scheduling that the plant does for us. We don't want to rush to plant, but we also don't want to hold off to plant. So sometimes we look at the soil temperatures for those key factors. Anything that is frost tender, tomatoes, peppers, all that warm season stuff, you do have to wait until after the frost date. A lot of the other stuff, the cool season stuff, you can plant earlier, and we look at either the germination rate if you're direct seeding it, or we're looking at whenever it's okay to plant it outside. So someone give me an example of a cool season crop, and if you know anything about the temperature where you can plant it outside?
Spinach.
I got spinach and peas. So tell me about spinach. Do you know what the temperatures are for spinach? Not exactly.
But I have a little area that's very warm, microclimate, and it's in full sun right in front of the house. I planted spinach 2 weeks ago, and it's up.
Right, you planted spinach 2 weeks ago, it's up. Radishes are cool too. So for spinach, typically the soil germination temperature is around 40. It can be a little bit lower, but we are actually around that temperature right now. So we're close. So you could go ahead and be looking at things like spinach and lettuce and onions and radishes and peas like now or within the next few weeks.
What about potatoes then, since the old superstitions plant on Good Friday?
See, you all out here plant them on Good Friday. West Virginians planted them on St. Patrick's Day. But that's because we were all Irish, really, we want to look at some of the temperatures, like the dates are okay to look at. Those are maybe, well, Good Friday probably isn't too early this year, because I think isn't Easter like the very end of April? Like it's, or it's the 12th? When is it? Yeah, the 12th. Good Friday is the 10th. Okay. I haven't looked at a calendar in a while. So we would have to find, and you can find actual, I don't know every vegetable off the top of my head, but there are some good resources that you can actually find for like garden, like germination temperatures and garden planting temperatures. There's a really good one that I have used before in my, like when I talk about seed starting, from, I think it's from the University of California. They have like the general seed starting temperatures. And for like spinach is on there, and their rate or their zone is like between 40 and 60, I think. But spinach, I think, can even go a little bit lower. We're talking California, so. Peas are about that same range, radishes, lettuce, stuff like that. So you can actually go ahead, like this is the time of year to start thinking about planting that kind of stuff. Most gardeners that are just beginning don't think about that. They think I go out and plant it, you know, May 10th, and that's when it grows. But those things don't do well when it gets hot. Planting them early can help, or waiting and planting as a fall crop, and we'll talk about that because we're going to do a scheduling and planning activity today. And we do have, like Scott was telling you, we have the weather station here that you can look up. Does everyone know how to find the soil temperature on there? No?
It's 40.
Okay, we'll do a show and tell here. Maybe. So here's your pop quiz. What is the website? Okay. Here is the chart that you will see. There are two places where you can see soil temperature on here. One of them is the real time, and one of them is like I think it's the average. And they are, we'll pop it up here because the pointer doesn't work, so I will be the pointer. You want to look for the 4-inch soil temperature 1. On here, soil temperature is currently 38 degrees. So we are getting ready for planting all of those early spring crops. You can also find it down here. So that's a chart with soil temperature. It's really hard to see the little line in there. So look for the number up here. And we don't need to worry about the 10-inch soil temperature because vegetables, especially this time of year, aren't going to put roots down that deep. So we're looking at the 4-inch soil temperature, which is 38, which means that, you know, it's supposed to be, what, almost 70 degrees this weekend? Yeah, so that'll probably pop right on up again, so you can go ahead and start thinking about planting those things.
Can you repeat that website? I know it's NE extension, but what's that?
mgextensionwx.com.
Plant, but be prepared to cover a bit.
You can be prepared to cover if we get those frosts, etc. But that is, you know, when we're talking about scheduling, you don't have to wait until May 10th.
John, before you change that, can I just say something about the GDD? That's growing degree days.
Oh,
That's-
perfect.
That's based on an average day temperature of 50.
Okay.
So if it's 60 on one day, 60 for a high, 40 for a low, the average temperature is 50, you're going to get 0. But everything averages above 50 then will start to accumulate in the GDD. And a lot of farmers would use that. It might be helpful. Some plants, for instance, will be based on a certain growing degree day range to plant also. It just, the warmer it is, you're going to start seeing that grow. I would imagine either Saturday and or Sunday, we should get our first, my guess is we'll get our first growing degree days, because I think our temperatures, at least on Sunday, will average above 50.
Yeah.
So look for that thing to change. But that's an indication when you start seeing those numbers going up, that means it's getting warm. I mean, duh. But,
Yeah.
but anyway.
So that is a good, so if you look, growing degree days are in the top column or top box. They're the three, so there's moon phase, sunrise, and then there's growing degree days. There's season, March, and Thursdays. So we didn't get any yesterday. We haven't gotten any in March. We haven't gotten any for the season. So they're still at 0. Like you said, once we get to where the average temperature, so that is daytime and nighttime, once those get above 50, we'll get to growing degree days, and that means that the growing season really is started off. And unless we get some like really hard freeze to kill everything that was growing, then it will continue. Even if it gets cold, stuff will sort of like go into stasis a little bit. Good, thanks for bringing that up.
I think with that chart, what's that little guy that crawls out and said, Punkatoli Phil or whatever his name is? I think he's getting me a little excited because he can't keep up with all of this.
Yes.
I scroll down, there's a cell temperature for daily soil temperature. Oh, okay.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the daily soil temperature.
That's where you're gonna look for whether to apply.
Yeah. Yeah, Mike was telling us that the daily temperature down in the bottom is if you're looking at applying a pre-emergent herbicide. That's where you go to look for the temperatures there.
And John, can I say one more on that soil temperature? You'll notice the very bottom, for those who can't read it, it's 32, the top is 41. And that's a week graph. So it's going to take, on Saturday and Sunday, our temperature was 32. And it was that way for probably about a month. And then suddenly the frost came out of the ground, and you can see how quickly during this week the temperatures begin to warm. So that was a critical function. We broke through the frost barrier. I mean, when you see a 32-degree temperature, that ground's frozen.
Mm-hmm.
And so we suddenly broke it on Sunday, and now we're shooting up rapidly. So that means the frost is out of the ground, good for flooding, all that stuff that means that we get some heavy rains now. The ground's going to start absorbing that moisture, as opposed to having a frozen soil where it's just not going to. But I've been looking at that graph. That really shot up this stuff.
Yeah, so the frost barrier broke, and so the temperatures are rising quickly now. And we can see that actually they were, when you scroll over it, you see a little bit more that they actually were up a little higher Wednesday, and they've come back down a little bit.
And you're going to see that in the spring as the nighttime temperatures drop. Like we had it was 26, I'm sorry, low this one, like 25. So the temperature dropped a little bit. So it's going to fluctuate a lot in the springtime.
John has something to add.
I
Oh,
have,
no.
I don't have anything to add. I just, if when you ask a question, I'll try to come over around and use it because we are taping.
Oh, true.
So either you could repeat the question or I could come up and have them help. Either way, whatever you want to do.
Okay, that works.
I had a call while I was on the phone here Wednesday, this family, a fence, and he wanted to know if the frost is out of the ground. I looked this up and the temperature on Wednesday was 38 degrees, which if he's gonna put a fence in, he has to go below 10 inches. So I said, I don't think the frost will be out of the ground at that level.
So when we were looking at that, so if you look, so we do have the 10-inch and it's at 39 degrees.
Yeah, but he's planting a fence.
Planting a fence, that could be something different.
Is the soil colder down below 10 inches? That's the question.
So not necessarily, because the earth actually has a more constant temperature underneath. It's about mid-50s usually.
Below 10 inches?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you like geothermal heating, there's a reason why they can dig a hole. So the earth is filled with magma and all that kind of stuff. We're not, but the lower you go, actually, it doesn't get colder. It actually gets warmer. Yeah. Now you learned something.
Now I didn't put his fence in.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about going into stasis? Because it seems like the last couple of years, if you planted on May 10, like your tomatoes and peppers, 2 weeks of really cold weather, and the plants just went into no growing. I mean, they just stalled for weeks.
Yeah, so I think so for that stasis that happened, I think there are two factors. So it could be the temperature that like it slows it down and it doesn't grow, and it does take a little while to come back. The other thing that can really slow down crops is excessive moisture, excessive rain, which we've had a lot of in the last few years. Because what happens, this is my theory, is that whenever we get those periods of excessive rain, you get a lot of root damage, and especially the root hairs. And the root hairs are what's responsible for uptaking of water and nutrients into the plant. If you've killed the root hairs, you have to wait for them to grow back, and then they can start taking up nutrients and things to feed the plant. So that's one of the things that has happened in the last few years.
And then if you have uncomposted soil, I mean, soil that's kind of outbalanced, then that's what compost does. It helps to equalize a lot of these problems. Too much rain, too little rain.
All right, so Marilyn was talking about compost, so that can help. Like the more organic matter you have, the more variation you can take in water because it holds and releases water rather than just, plain soil or other things. So, but it has been difficult. We grow hundreds of tomato plants in our variety trial, and like if we got them out early, they've sat there and done nothing. And so but then finally one day they just start taking off. And that's happened a few times. And I think it's a lot of a moisture issue with root damage. Planting time can often affect pests as well. They have to be present in order for it to take effect, and it depends on the pest. So I had someone email me this week asking about squash bugs. They said someone told them that if you delayed planting, that you could avoid squash bugs because they're only active during one part of the season. And they got it half right. Squash bugs are active throughout the season, so you can't delay planting to avoid squash bugs. Squash vine borer, the female is only active in like late May, early June. That's when she's laying eggs. So if you delay planting of, say, like your squash and you do a later crop, which you can do, you can sometimes avoid squash vine borer by planting later. But the squash bugs, I can offer no help. I saw a hand in the back.
Yes, sir, I apologize, I did not get the website correctly. Could you give it to us again, please?
That is MG Weather, or MG Extension WX.com. MG Extension, it's all lowercase.
And all
Yeah.
one word.
Yeah, all one word, and it's in the weekly update every week.
WX.com.
Yeah. And my lovely assistant, I saw another hand over here.
Don't call me lovely anymore.
Yes, I've seen a study out of Oregon State. They're saying they're finding too much organic matter in urban garden soils, recommending 3 to 5% organic matter as opposed to 10 or 15 or 20%. So, comment on that?
That is true. We tend to think more is better. So if you were to talk to my dad about his cooking practices, if it says to cook on medium, then high is better, right? And a lot of people think it's the same way with organic matter, that you can't have too much, but you actually can have too much. And the right amount is around 3 to 5% organic matter. If you're doing a raised bed and you say, I'm going to just fill it with compost, guess what? Not good. You have to have soil in there. You only really need 3 to 5% organic matter in there. There's a few different reasons. Some of it is fertility reasons. Some of it has to do even with diseases, especially on root crops. If you're growing things like carrots and potatoes and all those things, you can get like really scabby results. If you've ever seen like really scabby potatoes or carrots, some of that comes from organic matter. Yes, sir.
So if we're going to fill a raised bed with something that would be mostly soil, and how would a person go about researching the best place to get clean, reliably clean topsoil, and should that be tested?
You can look at different sources. So we have some of the local places that do mainly compost. So you can get your compost from there, like Hillside Solutions. All of those places actually have to test. So they should have a test on record to say that, you know, this is free of contaminants, etc. So that can be your compost portion. For the soil, you're either going to have to find a local source that sells bulk soil that you can go get by the truckload or the bucket full or a bag. All of them should be having the test information on there to make sure that it's contaminant free. One more.
What about cemetery soil?
Cemetery, okay.
I know that sounds really bad, but my neighbor, his dad is a caretaker at the cemetery, and when they dig out the plots, they, like some cemeteries, I know one in Bellevue, you can go and just load up truckloads of the soil on your own from the cemetery there.
Okay, should be like enough to fill like a raised bed, you know, like a sort of like 6 foot, you know, 6 foot raised bed. Yeah. One of the problems with that could be, as we look at the soil horizons, the lower you go, the more of the mineral stuff we have that is not as good. So there's probably more clay and more stuff done in there, as opposed to the more natural organic matter and the stuff that has come from the soil surface. But you could still use some of that. Does the other John have any? I saw you shaking your head.
That's exactly what I would be concerned about. You know, that's also a turf thing. And, you know, when you start looking at the horizons from 0, that's the first horizon, and basically that's duff, or the stuff that falls off of trees, which is highly desirable. It's a forest layer. And the next horizon down is the A layer, and the B layer, and the C layer. If you could somehow stratify that and only take the A and the B layer, that would be pretty good. If, however, the largest component is the C layer or the R layer, which is bedrock or a very heavy clay, then it wouldn't be nearly as good. So that's where you actually may want to use more compost when you amend that whole garden.
And if you're looking at that, so that's another thing that we see a lot of times. If you like have new construction, like you have a new housing area and they've graded, they've not brought in topsoil, they've just like taken off the top layers and graded that sea horizon is now the top. And so maybe in like 1,000 years, it will be, you know, good topsoil. The one thing we do have going for us here is if you are in an area, maybe if that was more prairie-like in the past, prairie soils, those top horizons are deeper. So you still could have some decent soil up above. And so you can take a look at that. Typically, also, if it's, you know, we put cemeteries on top of hills typically, and the way that erosion happens, that, you know, most of the good layers erode off anyway. So you have to take a look at that. So I would take a look at it to see.
They do actually good for tomatoes.
Really good for tomatoes?
Yeah.
Okay.
The first year I did that, my tomatoes were amazing.
So I said one more. I see one more. Oh, you sure?
If there's an expansion of the cemetery, you might have.
Said if it was an expansion of a cemetery that was previously maybe a production field, there could be some herbicide or pesticide residues. Typically, for most of the things we use, have a short shelf life. You know, they don't persist as long as sort of media has made them out to persist. So they break down pretty quickly. So what do we do when we look for sources of information? So we want to seek trustworthy sources of garden info. We can find all kinds of stuff online that can mislead us. We want to investigate those dubious claims and avoid mis and fake info on social media and ask questions. And there are some good sources for us. So you're here, so that means that you're interested in knowing actual garden info and not you know, misinformation. It's amazing to see the amount of misinformation that you see online around stuff like gardening. You know, we get those things that rotate around like the homemade, you know, here's the homemade weed killer, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And so there are some good sources of information to look for. If you're online, outside of this office, you know, we have Facebook, we have webpage, we have stuff going on all the time. If you don't follow us, Douglas Sarpy Extension, you should. Also, the National Master Gardener Program has a social media presence, and they're always posting good information. Once upon a time, Terry James, the state coordinator, was the leader of the group that did this, and I was actually a member that it was my job every Monday to make all the posts on the Facebook page, but since I don't coordinate Master Gardener programs anymore, I gave that up. And so you can find information on there, on the Extension Master Gardener page. And then there's another good source that I'm still a part of. It's called the Garden Professors. And we're a group of Extension faculty around the country that really work to dispel myths around gardening. And, you know, of course, my specialty is vegetable gardening, but we have a person on there. Her name is Linda Chalker Scott. She is from Washington State. She is like mother garden professor. She's the one that started it all. But you can find our page. So we actually write blogs every week. There's a new blog post. Mine is supposed to go up next week. I should probably write that sometime. And talking about some sort of aspect about gardening. We always pull in scientific sources, so we look for journal articles and research to tie into those things. And then there's what's called the Garden Professors blog, which is where it's like a group on Facebook where you can ask questions and interact with people. So you have a garden question, you can ask it, and you can actually search back through all the posts that they've done to see what, you know, we get the stuff about, you know, you hear all the time about the myths, like you know, can I make pesticide out of vinegar and Epsom salts? And, you know, if you ask those questions over and over again, you will get, you know, snarky comments back. But people will use like research papers and stuff to answer your questions. So that's a good source of information. And the website, gardenprofessors.com, is where the blog is posted. And so it's posted there every week. We have a new article. So I want to finish up before break, talking about selecting plants again. And we're going to talk about plant genetics, because when we go to the garden center, we might see some words that confuse us. We might also see words that maybe we saw on Facebook that we should be afraid of. And so we are going to talk through some of what those words mean before break. It's a great place to talk about it, because then if you get angry or upset, or, you know, you can always come and berate me during break. So we're going to talk about 4 words that you might see on a seed packet. Those words are heirloom, open pollinated, hybrid, and GMO. So those are the 4 words that we're going to talk about. The first word that I'm going to talk about is open pollinated. What open pollinated means is that if you save the seed from a plant, especially one that is self-pollinated, that it will breed true. You save the seeds and you will get what you thought you were saving it from. Tomatoes are a good example of this. Number one, most tomatoes are self-pollinated. You can plant a tomato here and plant another tomato a few feet away, and left to their own devices, they will not cross-pollinate. You have to have some sort of breakage of the flower, like by a bumblebee or something, to actually have cross-pollination, because the flowers are enclosed. If the tomato is an open pollinated variety, that means that when it self-pollinates, if you save the seeds from that variety, you're going to get that variety next year. The genetics are stable enough that you don't get crossing of the genes, and you get basically what you saved. This leads us to heirloom. Heirloom is an open pollinated variety that has a story. It either has some sort of family or regional history, or it has been around for at least 50 years. There's two different rules used whenever we're talking about an heirloom. Can you name an heirloom tomato?
Mortgage lifter.
Mortgage lifter.
Purple.
Cherokee purple, black crim. I love that the first example was mortgage lifter. Do you know why?
I believe during the Depression, a lot of people planted that variety because it was a way for them to grow their own food and they couldn't afford to go out and buy it.
So she was talking about growing mortgage lifter during the Depression when people didn't have food and they could grow their own food. It's a close story. So here's the history of the mortgage lifter. It's from the state of West Virginia. There's actually two competing stories, 2 counties apart, about the history of the mortgage lifter. They're both the same story. One guy's name, and this is if you actually buy it in a catalog, you buy the seeds, it's called Radiator Charlie's Mortgage Lifter. His name was Radiator Charlie. And Radiator Charlie hand-crossed tomato plants in his garden until he found one that he loved. And he convinced all of his friends and family members that it was the best tomato ever. Well, Radiator Charlie was a salesman. He could sell anything. And so he convinced his friends and neighbors that they all needed to buy mortgage lifter tomato plants from him. So he sold all of his neighbors these tomato plants, and he sold enough to pay off the mortgage. That's why it's called the mortgage lifter. So he paid off the mortgage on the farm by selling these tomato plants. And there's a story, a very similar story, the next county over that's like within 5 years. So who knows which one is the right story, or even if they are the right story, but mortgage lifter has that story. So it is an heirloom tomato. It's open pollinated. If you save the seeds, then next year you plant them, you're going to get something very close to the mortgage lifter. It can be very like tiny differences based on like how well you grew it in your garden. You're going to pick the best mortgage lifter that grew in your garden. So now it has like specific genetics to your garden, to your area.
What year did you do this?
This was in the 1920s, 20s, and 30s. So one of them is pre-Depression, one of them is during the Depression. How about an heirloom Nebraska tomato variety? Nebraska wedding. So the Nebraska wedding tomato was a gift to a bride on her wedding day. Wasn't that a lovely gift? Like, so happy for you. Here's a tomato, right? But you can still get seeds for the Nebraska wedding tomato. It's sort of an orangey colored tomato. It's not a red tomato. So it is open pollinated. If you save the seeds, basically you're going to get something very similar because the genetics are stable enough that they don't switch around in there. Now, some pros and cons of heirlooms. You get a choice of interesting, exciting varieties. You all can name off these different varieties very easily. They have interesting histories and they can be adapted regionally. You save the seeds. It is adapted to your garden because you picked the best one to grow. However, there are some big cons to heirlooms. Most often, they do not have disease resistance. You're going to get lots of rots and spots on there unless you do some sort of treatment. They may not grow well in all regions because they were developed in some other country or some other state, and they may not grow well here. So just because you see an heirloom in a catalog doesn't mean it grows well where you live. And they can be unpredictable. Some of them have lower yield. When we talk about hybrids, we're going to talk about something called hybrid vigor. So hybrids actually produce more. Just is some freak reasoning, whenever we get the genes moving around, they actually are more productive plants. Which leads us to hybrids. So hybridization is a controlled method of cross-pollination. Someone wants to develop a new plant. They find plant A that has a characteristic that they like. They find plant B that has a characteristic that they like. They set out to pollinate it. So you typically do hand pollination. They'll take the pollen from one plant and apply it to the flower of the other plant. It is very purposeful. There might be many, many crosses back through the family history. They don't just cross one plant and then the next. If you actually look at some of the modern cultivars of hybrids that are produced for gardens, you can actually see a very long lineage of lots of crosses that they've done over years. So it could go back to like, grandparents, 20, 30, 40 different grandparents to get that one tomato or one bean that has this disease resistance and this flavor and this color. The genetics aren't as stable for open pollinated. So what happens is, to produce the seed to plant, you have to always have the mother and the father in order to process those. So you have to cross-pollinate them every time in order to get the seeds that you want to grow. Exactly. So if you think about a hybrid tomato, who here has a hybrid tomato that grew all the time?
There we go.
I knew a celebrity was going to be the first one. Celebrity is the most common, very common slicing tomato. Celebrity is a hybrid. So there's a mother and a father plant that has to be crossed every time to get the celebrity seeds. So what happens is you plant them in the garden. You want to save seeds from those. There's a myth out there that says, oh, you can't save seeds from a hybrid, or they don't produce seeds that are viable. I've heard both of those. Guess what? You can save seeds from most hybrids. What happens is you get the genes separating. And so you get some that will look like a celebrity tomato, about a quarter of them. And then you get about a quarter of them that looks like the mother. You get about a quarter of them that looks like the father. And you get a quarter of them that looks like the milkman. And so it's very, very varied in what you will get. And those numbers are very general. There are more specific numbers. If you've ever done Mendelian genetics and Punnett squares, that's how it works. And so you will get some tomatoes that look like a celebrity tomato, but only a small fraction of them. So what you could do, if you wanted, is you could save those seeds, plant them. You save seeds from the ones that look like celebrity tomatoes, plant them. Next year, the proportions are different, but you still get the differences. After about 3 or 4 years, if you always save the ones that look like celebrity tomatoes, you're going to have an open pollinated variety based on celebrity tomatoes that grows in your garden. I saw a hand and my assistant over there, who's no longer lovely.
My volunteers seem to be cherry tomatoes.
Cherry.
I don't plant a cherry tomato, but it seems to, do they kind of revert? Is that one of the parents?
So some of them do have cherry in their lineage. So that's a good point. Because cherry tomatoes are so prolific that sometimes they will pop that genetics in there to get them to produce more. And cherry tomatoes love to reproduce.
Yes, they do.
Right? So, it could be from somewhere else, like some animal ate a cherry tomato in someone's garden. They walked through your yard, they plopped it out, and they kept walking, right? And so we can see those differences in those different plants. If you're interested, I actually have a book in my library in my office that a friend of mine wrote, and it's called Plant Breeding for the Home Gardener. And he talks about that process of creating your own open pollinated variety on a hybrid cultivar. And then also, if you want to like cross different things in your garden, it's an interesting little book.
John, can insects cross-pollinate?
Yes, so pollen, it doesn't, so hybrid is what our end result is. So it can be by wind pollination, it can be insect. If someone is doing the pollination to produce a seed, they control that. So if it is something that is insect pollinated, they exclude insects from getting to it and they do the pollination by hand. So it'll be like covering the plants so that bees can't get to them. A few years ago, we did some pollination. We grew some ponca squash for the seed library at the library. And we put bags around the female flowers so that we could protect them until the male flower opened and we hand pollinated them.
So you might get an heirloom just for insect power.
Yeah, if you save seeds from stuff that is insect pollinated that you haven't protected, you're going to get who knows what. And it can be interesting because some things that you don't realize are related. Zucchini and pumpkins are the same species and they will cross. And so I have had people show up my office with a green pumpkin or an orange zucchini. We call them puccinis. Yes, ma'am.
What you buy in the store, it says greenhouse grown, what are?
If you buy it in the store, it says greenhouse grown. It's probably just a plant grown in a greenhouse, probably like so greenhouse grown is just the growing technique. It has nothing to do with the genetics. It's all about, did someone start it in a greenhouse and propagate it?
So how do we know what it is?
Well, hopefully it'll have a tag and it'll say like hybrid, heirloom, something like that. So with hybrids, we have increased pest resistance, we have higher yields, and typically whenever they're breeding a new hybrid, they want it out to as many gardeners as possible so it does well across most of the US or most of the world. Some of them don't have as much interest as the heirlooms. Tomatoes these days are a dime a dozen. We do the testing for the All-America selections, and they send us, by far the most popular thing they send us to test is tomatoes, and they all look exactly the same. Like they're nothing exciting. We hate that they send it. So this year we are trialing 19 new tomatoes. And inconsistency with saved seed. So if you try to save it, you're not going to get the true breeding every year. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about, GMO, genetically engineered. So this is another technique that is used for rapid reproduction of plants with specific genes. So I was telling you about that hybridization process. That can take years and years and years. And especially if it's a slower growing plant. So vegetables, they can produce new plants usually within 5 to 10 years. If it's like a woody plant, I once went to the breeding farm at University of Arkansas, and it's their small fruit program. That's where most of our blackberries and raspberries come from, all the new ones. On average, it takes them 30 years to develop a new blackberry variety because of the growth rate and because you have to randomly cross everything, wait for it to grow, see what you like, and then pick and cross again. With genetic engineering, they take one gene that they like and they use a few different techniques to fit it into the plant. There's also a new technology evolving that a lot of people don't consider the same as this because basically it just shuts a gene out. It doesn't add anything new, it just stops something from producing, and it's called CRISPR. So the one thing that is at the vet you might find in the produce section is called an Arctic apple. What happened is that they turned off the gene that has the chemical that turns brown when an apple is exposed to oxygen. So the apple will not turn brown until it rots, basically. So some people argue since they're not adding anything, it's not really GMO because they're not adding something new in. The one thing that you can think about and know, the safety, these have been tested for safety for decades now, and there have been no known cases of risk to humans from this. So that's one thing to know. The second thing to know is that it doesn't matter. Because if you go to a seed rack, you look at a garden catalog, there are no genetically engineered seeds in there. They are not available to home gardeners. Number one, there are only 9 major crops that they create genetically engineered. They're the big commodity crops. So corn, soy, cotton, and then papayas. Right? The only thing that you might possibly find is there's like 1 or 2 types of yellow squash that were developed with a BT gene so that they're insect resistant. Wouldn't you like to have an insect resistant squash plant? Too bad you can't buy it. To purchase a genetically engineered crop, you have to sign an agreement that says you will not save the seed, distribute the seed, reproduce the seed. And number 2, they sell them in large quantities. These seed companies aren't going to produce something that they sell you for like $1 a packet. So there are no genetically engineered crops available for home gardeners, period. So you might ask, well, why do all these seed companies advertise that they're GMO free? It's called marketing. And it's fear-based marketing. So it's like, our seeds are GMO free. Well, are their seeds GMO free? You better buy ours, right? So.
How do you think the new idea of of grafting plants such as tomatoes and others are going to affect this idea of plant genetics?
So we had a question about, so there is such a thing as tomato grafting these days. And we were asking about what the effect would be on genetic engineering. Right now, what they're doing is they're taking traditionally produced hybrids that are disease resistant, using them as the rootstock and grafting on heirloom tomatoes, so that then the plant has disease resistance. They may at some point develop some of those rootstocks with genetic engineering, but so far they haven't. They've all been traditionally hybridized. One more question, and then we're going to go to break. We're going to start dancing.
Are commercially grown tomatoes GMOs?
No, that brings up another good point, is that most things, like I said, there are only 9 things really that are genetically engineered. Tomatoes aren't one. There is no genetically engineered tomato in existence. They tried one in the 80s. It was horrible. No one bought it. They discontinued it. It's called Flavor Saver. It tasted, the flavor they were saving was cardboard. So there are no genetically engineered tomatoes. There's no genetically engineered lettuce, carrots, peppers, none of that. They don't exist. So you can't buy them. We're going to take a break. We'll be back in what, 10?
Why don't we come back at 10:50? 10:50.
Later on about frost.
Okay, I know you're gonna run there. It's all part of the learning. That's right. And again, where I am, just share someone else.
What I've learned, and this is basically for planting like vegetables and shrubs and whatnot, this is for me back east, like from Pennsylvania, and it was, I was talking to some Indian country with oak trees that the leaves the size of mouse. You know, the soil temperature is about 55 degrees, and you're pretty much good to go. That's what I do. Okay, all right. They're almost exactly the same, right? It tells you so much about soil temperature. And so to me, it's a really simple act. I'm going to talk to you.
Find our seats again. Professor Porter has a lot more wisdom to share, so we can find our seats again, that would be great.
Yeah, I have a lot of stuff down there, the hardier stuff, the cabbage, that sort of thing. With the lettuce, I've done that. I don't know why, other than the first second, it just seems like the lettuce, it's just in the carrot or another. Those seeds are so tiny, looking in the sand, it's sort of, I guess I just have to do those. Whatever. Yeah, okay, very good.
Okay, the stage is yours once again, Professor.
Thank you, thank you. I guess we need to hit a light here somewhere. There we go. Well, I hope you enjoyed your break. Let me find my clicker here. There we go. Okay. What we're going to talk about next, I'll give some guidance and information, and then what I'm going to do after I get through some information is we will have an activity that you'll work on with your table mates as a group activity. Gotta love group activities, right? We'll finish up with any more questions that we have. So when we're talking about scheduling our vegetable garden, some of us might have learned today that we don't have to wait until May 10th to go out and plant everything. Someone was talking about they'd already started their lettuce and onions and stuff indoors, and it's almost time that they could plant it outdoors. And so we have all of those things going on. When we're looking at everything else, we really want to think about making the most of our garden space by scheduling our garden to make use of that space. Whenever we think about the things that we grow, we have those early season things that we can grow, the cool season things we can go ahead and plant now. We have the things that come along for the warm season that we can start planting in May, but we can actually extend up through a few months. And then we also have an opportunity to come back for the fall and plant those cool season crops again. Because if we think about it, whenever we get to the fall, it starts getting cooler and cooler, and those things will thrive throughout the end of the season. If we plant some of those things now, we will get a good harvest from them. If we wait until May, we may not get a good harvest before it gets too hot. So think about, if you've ever grown something like a broccoli or a cabbage, and you've waited until May to plant it, how well does it do? Not very well. It will bolt, so it will flower. You'll get all kinds of pests and diseases. It won't grow well. You can plant it early. You will get a decent harvest for that before it gets too hot. Or if you come back and actually plant it later in the summer for a fall crop, then the temperature actually turns perfect for it later on. We think about when we're seed starting, we look at those starting temperatures, and for the cabbages and the cold crops, the broccolis, all that stuff, even though they're cool season crops, we still need that warm temperature to germinate them and get them going. So planting them at the end of the summer is actually the perfect time to plant those. You can plant some now, but think about planting some later on. And the one little trick that you might even think about, yes, you can start them as plants indoors for fall planting, but guess what? The temperatures can be right outside for them to germinate in the garden because they need about that 75-degree soil temperature. So think about that when you're scheduling. So we think about ways that we plant different things. So we have 3 different types. There's succession planting. So I plant my early season crop. I plan it to finish up early on in the season. So I go ahead and I plant my warm season crop after it or in amongst it, which goes through the season. And then toward the end of the season, I can come back with a fall crop. And so I planted 3 crops in the same space through succession planting. These plants can be, you plant it, you harvest it, you plant something else, you harvest it, you plant something else, or you plant something, you thin it out as you start harvesting, you plant something in amongst it, and then the thing that you planted early sort of just peters out toward the middle of the season, and then you replace it with some other cool season at the end of the season. A good example I could think of is, okay, I sow my lettuce now, I get my lettuce going in my garden, and it's up within a week or 2. I can actually start harvesting small lettuce plants pretty soon. Then when it gets to the end of April, early May, I find spaces in that bed where I want to plant my tomatoes. And I clear out that, maybe I've cleared out that one lettuce plant that was in the way. I stick a tomato in there. It's going to start growing while my lettuce finishes up. And even if the tomato starts getting really big, it's actually going to extend the life of the lettuce because the shade the tomato plant creates cools the soil and keeps the lettuce from bolting before if it had full sun. So it will shade it out. And then at some point in the middle of the season, my lettuce will be done. It'll all be ripped out, cleaned out. I have my tomato. And then I can either remove my tomato once it starts looking bad toward the beginning of fall, or I can sow something around it. I can come back and do radishes around it. And then they're ready to go once I pull out that tomato plant. So you can be very purposeful like that. You can even think about some of those crops that we plant, and I think we touch on season extension if we get all the way through this talk. Some of those cool season crops you plant for the fall, once you get them up to a certain size, if it gets cold enough, they will sort of like chill out in the garden. They will actually sort of hang out there and you can harvest them until they die out. And you can extend that with some season extensions, some row covers and plastic cover, something like that. But it wouldn't be it would be within the realm of possibility that you could be harvesting some leafy greens and broccoli and stuff like that for the holidays. And we have some stuff that we would also overwinter if you can protect it. So a lot of those leafy greens like kale and chard, they're biennials, so they're a 2-year plant. So if you can keep it from dying in the winter, it will be going again in the spring. So if you protect it with some sort of covering, whenever we get the really cold temperatures, because they can survive pretty well a heavy frost or even a light freeze. Those don't die out until you get like below, like the teens and below, but you can use a plastic or a row cover to protect them. Relay planting is where we're planting the same thing multiple times. So the example I used earlier was the carrots. I don't need 200 carrots at once. So I'll go out today and I will sow 20 carrots. And then in 2 weeks, I will find another spot in the garden and sow another 20 carrots. And then I can have those carrots instead of, it always happens where, okay, I planted everything at once and there's like a few week window where everything looks good. And then like you have those carrots that like they are grotesque looking by the end of the season because they're over mature, like ugly, pithy looking, like knotty, all kinds of stuff. So the relay planting, especially for some of those crops, can be helpful. And then another example that I gave was maturity planting. Okay, I have 2 different types of green beans I'm going to plant. I can plant them on the same day. One of them matures at 80 days, one of them matures at 100 days. So I've actually done, the harvest will be at a different time, even though I planted them at the same time. And so that gives me green beans extended throughout the season for fresh eating. If I wanted to maybe do canning, I would want a bunch of them to mature at once. So I will plant more of that one that matures at that time. But if I don't want to can, or if I want to spread them out through the season, I want to pick different varieties that have different maturation dates if I'm planting them all at the same time. Or I want to do relay planting if they're the same variety that I'm using. There is a general guideline of the crops, the early season, the warm season, the late season. Some of them on the early and late, I don't have them on each list because they do a little bit better in that season. But we look at the early season crops: beets, cabbage, lettuce, onions, peas, radishes, spinach, mustard, turnips, a lot of the leafy greens, some of the root crops. The long season crops, what we would call the warm season crops, those are the things that you typically have to plant after the frost date and will die at the first frost. All your warm season stuff, your tomatoes, peppers, all those kinds of things are on that list. And then on the fall, we add all those leafy greens back in, and I think that is when all the broccoli and the cabbage and stuff do much better. And that's when I typically tell people, especially if they're planting it for the first time, to plant it. And there are some of those things that are especially like Brussels sprouts, that they're really hard to grow in the early season because they just take so long to mature, and it's going to get really hot before they get matured.
I know the weather is unpredictable in Nebraska, but generally speaking, when would you say the late season planting should start?
So Carol says that typically weather is unpredictable in Nebraska, and it is getting more unpredictable. So when do we plant? So for a lot of those cold crops, the bigger crops, I would probably concentrate around the end of July, early August for those, like the broccoli and the cabbage. You can either transplant them or sow them. You might get a little wiggle room. You might go a little bit later than that, but that is around the time for that. For some of the faster growing stuff, the leafy greens, the radishes stuff, you could go later than that. And so you can really find what works for you for those. So look at one thing that you can do is look at like the seed packet or look up the maturation information. So if you are planting something from seed for a fall crop, you look at the days to maturity on the packet, and then you add a little bit because it slows down growing as you get into the cooler weather. And also, you want a harvest window. So you want a few weeks in order to harvest. And you can think about this for warm season crops as well. So we tend to think, oh, I have to go and plant all my tomatoes, peppers, and beans on May 10th. But you can actually plant a lot of those up until that midsummer point. So even into July, you can be planting some of those warm season stuff because it will mature early enough to get a crop in the fall, especially if we're thinking about things like beans and cucumbers and squash. So what you look is at the seed packet. Okay, I want to plant these beans for a fall crop. The seed packet says days to maturity, 65 days. I look at the calendar for my first frost date in the fall. Any guesses?
October.
It's around October 12th. It can be a little bit around that time, a little bit later, a little bit earlier, depending on the weather. So you will look at your calendar, you will count back 65 days from then. You'll add about 2 weeks for a harvest window and add another 2 weeks for the temperature slowdown. That's if you want to guarantee that you will have a harvest. So about 90 days. That's one rule that you can use if you have a seed packet starting from seed. If you're planting, they'll mature much faster. And you want to think about that.
John,
Yes, ma'am.
I find that if I want to do fall planting, it's difficult to find seeds.
That's also something that we can talk about, is that most of the retailers have already sent their seeds back by the time for fall planting. Number one, retailers don't sell stuff when you're supposed to plant it. They sell it when they think they can sell it. That's why you can go to retailers now and buy garlic. Because you don't plant garlic until October.
So it's
Whenever-
okay to get your seeds, I mean, get extra now and then just plant them in the fall?
That is what I would recommend, is to get extra seeds now, if you know you're wanting to do fall planting, and save them until then. You can, sometimes retailers will save some of the smaller will have later in the season, but a lot of the big box stores, they've already sent their stuff back from this time. So plan ahead, and plan to have some on your shelf in the storage room. If you're wanting to start with transplants, it's even harder to find transplants that time of year. Some of the small garden centers will have some, but they're typically like what they've held over from the spring. And so you might want to think about starting your own. One other thing we can talk about when we're scheduling is looking at a more multi-year schedule for crop rotation. And we do this for good pest reduction. And we also do it for soil nutrient usage. So there are some crops that heavy feed on some nutrients, or their root structure does something different to the soil. And so we want to keep things mixed up. A lot of the pests that we have are specific to families. If we think about tomato hornworms, they're specifically on those tomato and tomato relative crops. So if we rotate, we can reduce instances of pests, especially pests that don't move very far within the garden. And also it's a big factor in diseases. So if we have a lot of, say, leaf spot on our tomatoes, if we move them to a new place, that soil has fewer of the spores in there for it to contaminate the tomato in the new year. We want to rotate crops on a few year basis. If you have room, a lot of people, small gardens, they say, I don't have enough room to rotate my crops. Hopefully you can, and we want to do it on a 4-year basis. And we typically tell people to rotate by family or family groups. And so what we're going to do in just a minute, I see my assistant ran away. So I will ask for an assistant. Is at your table, I'm going to give you an activity that involves crop rotation, and it also involves small scale planting and spacing. We haven't talked about spacing yet. We will, but this will be like, try it first and then we'll talk about it. And it has some of the spacings on there when we're talking about intensive planting. And they're based on the principle of square foot gardening. And so we will have this activity that I will distribute for you. If I have an assistant or two right there, we will distribute these one per table. So we split all these up. So it's all 3 of these sheets.
One per table.
One per table, so I could use another assistant.
Got a question where you're getting this distributed.
Yes.
When a seed packet says days to maturity, 65 days, does that include the time it takes for that seed to germinate?
Sometimes it will say specifically on there. Typically, it is from the time you start the seed to whenever you get a crop. So it includes the seed starting time. And we have to remember that day to maturity is like perfect world. Like, is your garden a perfect garden? Is your seed starting perfect? That is like the potential of the plant. You should have 1 large sheet and 2 small sheets per table. And we will work on this. So while we are distributing it, what you're going to get is a scenario. You're going to get a list of plant families. You're also going to get spacing on there. Can't remember. these are actually the same thing. They're the same thing, so you only need one of the small sheets and one of the large. I didn't realize they were separated by pile. Does everyone?
Do you want the lights up?
Got lights up. So the small sheets are the same. If we don't have enough, we can steal some from another table. Extras. You should have one large sheet and one small sheet. I can take extra small sheets. You have one, you only need one. Do we have enough of everything? Do we need a small sheet? Okay. I will explanate everything here, and then I will turn you loose for a few minutes to work at your group. If they have a pen, that's all they need. Here's what I want you to do. You have the large sheet. These are your vegetable beds. This is your plan that you will be developing. This is the instructions and information you will need. So you have been asked to develop a vegetable garden plan for a local demonstration garden to demonstrate the principles of intensive gardening, including spacing, succession planting, and vertical gardening. If you know anything about vertical gardening. If not, don't include that. Use your knowledge of these techniques to develop a plan for a 4x8 bed over a full year period, including spring, summer, fall, and potentially overwintered plants, if you so wish. You want to incorporate as many practices that we've talked about as you can. And use season extension if you know anything about that. So I sort of put it here because I've taught you about some of these things, and I haven't taught you about some of the others, and you'll learn about them. So it's sort of like a little introduction to some of these things. So what you have on this list, you have the plant family list for vegetable gardens. And you also have some plant spacing guidelines on the back. Here's your challenge. I want you to incorporate at least 4 different plant families. I'm going to make this difficult. I'm going to give you 10 minutes. There you go, trial by fire. You will be great.
What you do is pick 4, and then use the flip side, and check against it, and make it happen. Because once you do it 4 years in a row.
Spring crops
Radishes. I'll tell you what. That way. Jesus is your initial guide, start getting there. So since the stage one, you go with these, and you do that as your first thing, right up the bat, you go, right? And so since you just go about the ones that are circle, right? And then flip to the back here and start figuring out your spacing based on that. But he
So
doesn't.
meters, that, and then with those you can do that, what are you, with succession, or every couple weeks you, that's,
You can do that, but the other thing you can actually do is, let's say you have, right, so let's say you do radishes and lettuce at the beginning, you're going to follow that right up with tomatoes right behind it. Or something else that's more seasonal. That's what it's really saying.
Alright, we need another. How to know, okay.
I just certain ones that are certain.
Oh, I know, but then there's this, artichokes. I just know they take like forever to start.
I'm going to say we have limited time. Simpler we can do it, the better. So I'd say pick like 6 to 10 and just move it.
I
would look at it spring. You can almost do like every single thing that's circle. Just top everything that's circle. And you can call that your early spring. And then if you can succeed, immediately go into summer right from there. Right? So you could go lettuces, radishes, all the early stuff on the spring side. In fact, ready event like that is like stuff when you get into fall. Yeah, you're wise, you're doing it right way there. Right now, the ones where but he's going to call fall. You would say full season. What I'd say you would try to do really hard to spring everything you have. When you get into summer, you maintain some of the spring going across. just like we're gonna see succession whole stuff in, but still maintain a few of the spring. I would say throw the whole thing as the spring, and then start to see the sequential or the sequence, and then start to put in incremental. So I just fill the whole thing as the spring, just fill it, whatever you want to do. And then what I say is you can just write the name in, like radish, and you know the space. Yeah, that's what I would do. So how many total can you do per string? And then break that up and count the number of squares and figure out how you want to do the stuff with squares that way. If you want to have lettuce going a lot longer, then you maybe want to double or triple up the lettuce and spinach, maybe the beans. But radish to me is so limited on what you want to do, and they produce so much in radish. So to me, it's like lettuce, spinach, peas is what you focus on. With a certain number of radish. I don't know if there's any spring and summer. Okay, so you can do some of that. So, what we add to stage and stuff, I'm not going to be that concerned about the cooking. Let's add carrots. Let's go back to the spring. Let's add more of that. So you have lettuce, you have peas. Let's add onions, carrots. Cabbage, broccoli, and beets. I wouldn't worry so much about that. What I would do is just what you're doing there, write them down in the squares, and then you can figure out the spacing accurately. You can get your squares going and figure out your spacing accurately. So the work on that list there, you have a total of 24 squares. That's how I would end it. Right, it's 4 crossed by 8, right, so it's 36, right, excuse me. Did my math, 32. We have 9. Now, the next thing is, where do you want to focus on concentration? But like radish, like say maybe 1 or 2 notes on radish, which we have 1. Next thing is how many on lettuce? Like 2, 3. How many on spinach? 2, 3. How many on peas? 4 to 5. And then we're looking at something like carrots, cabbage, broccoli. Now those are ones that I think a lot of people mention, so I because you can hand them. Those are all great. I think like one want to say numbers. What I'd like to do is figure out how many squares. Right, spacing is different, not trees. These are what I call squares. You're doing 4 squares of peas. How many squares of carrots, how many squares of cabbage, how many squares of broccoli? And I just start filling it up. Just like 1, 2, 3, 4. And you just originally say those are the beans, and then start figuring out from there. I mean, we got to get some on the paper. So I just say start right down on 4 beans. Let's try 4 broccoli. Then see what you have left over. And have to throw it from the box. Then you can do 4 cabbage, 4 carrots, and then see what you have left over.
You all look like you're working very hard, but it's time to stop. We've got more to talk about. It is not a 10-minute exercise, but we only have 10 minutes. So what I'll ask for now is if I have 1 or 2 groups that would like to share about their process and their plan and how they approach that. So we can share out. I know we won't be able to hear from everyone, and I know, so I hear the rumblings up here. That was not a 10-minute exercise, right? But it's to get you thinking. If you want to practice more of this at home, these forms, this information went into the box folder for your class materials. So you do have it. So you will have the plant family list, you have the spacing list, you even have the blank forms that you can design a 4x8 bed. And I will tell you, for the most part, I am one of these people that my first gardening tool that I use of the season is graph paper. I plan it out. Because we can make good use of space. And even speaking from an American gardening standpoint, we're kind of unique in most of the world that we even plant stuff in rows. So it's amazing to see how people garden around the world. Last year, I had an opportunity as a grad student to go to Rwanda. We went to a rural village and helped them with their daily chores, one of which was helping with harvesting. And it's amazing to see how people in this part of Rwanda had very poor soils, very poor production, and the way that they grow things is by broadcasting. They go out into the vegetable garden and they just throw things, and wherever it lands is where it grows. It's good for interplanting because you've got your beans and your corn and everything all growing together, but the production is just very poor. And after that trip, I had the opportunity, we actually have a program at the university sponsored by the Buffett Foundation that brings Rwandan students here to the university to study for their 4-year degree. And we have they did it for 4 years and they did 50 students per year. So now we have, this fall, we have 200 Rwandan students on campus at UNL. Over the summer, I went out, when I had a joint appointment with NCTA out in Curtis, they rotated a group of them out to there for 16 weeks of agricultural learning. And I had a group, and it was very interesting to see these students from Rwanda that had never grown things in rows. So we actually talked about growing things in rows, and it was very exciting to some of them. Some of them are majoring in things like engineering. And so I did an activity like this. We did the whole garden space. I made them plan the whole garden space, and you should have seen the excitement of these college-age students with their graph paper planning a vegetable garden. Right? It was amazing. And we threw in things like we had drip irrigation that we threw in, and so we were engineering our garden space. So if you want to make the most use of your garden space, you should think about a little engineering and planning in the beginning. Get out your graph paper and do that. Hopefully, I get to go back to Rwanda this May. However,
Yes.
we've already been told that, so all the remaining spring travel abroad programs have been canceled. And they have halted making any agreements for summer programs. So if there was like, we can't make hotel arrangements or anything that we still needed to make, they've all been put on hold. So I might not be going back. So we will see. I would like 1 or 2 groups to share your process. You don't have to like go through the entire plan and tell us what you're planting where, but tell us about the process of how you figured out. I see John has picked a group. Yes, and they're going to share.
I am not the expert. The expert is our intern, Paulette, who is already in the stages of planning, and she was so clever as to take some notes. So she had questions today. She had her expert available to answer her questions. So this is our original draft. This is pre-Paulette making her design. But what we did was, and you're right, John, this is not a 10-minute activity, or perhaps I talked too much. Our spring, we planted chives, peas, radishes, spinach, and cabbage. And Paulette advised us, you have your peas go vertical, and you plant your turnips and your radishes underneath them so that you can double up on your harvesting, which was a great idea. Our summers is more extensive. We have 1 tomato plant per square foot, 1 cucumber plant per square foot. Because she makes her own salsa, she has 8 square feet dedicated to peppers. And then underneath, let's see, or next to our cucumbers, we have the strawberry plant, and there was an aphid answer in there, and I want her to provide that. Was wondering if that would be a good idea to plant nasturtium flowers as a companion with the tomatoes, because they attract the aphids. That's just what I read recently.
Okay.
I'm sure that's true.
So here's the tea on aphids and plants and companion planting. We find that a lot of those things that you'll read about, like the companion plants, like there's a book, Carrot Loves Tomatoes, right? A lot of those things are really not based in research, they're based in anecdotes. Like one person observed this at one point and they wrote, they told your friends about it and now it's in a book. So for the most part, a lot of those companion planting things, we can say they're not true or they can't be replicated by research, which might be a nicer way to say those. So a lot of those things we can't really say are true. I mean, if they work for you, keep on keeping on. But we can't replicate a lot of those things in research. And some of those things are things that like we might even have believed for a long time ourselves and told people, it's like, oh, if you want to keep insects or nematodes away from your tomatoes, you plant marigolds. That's, you hear people talk about that. There is no research to prove that. And actually, the only research that shows any effect is if you were to plant the marigolds and then cut them down, chop them up, and dig them into the soil, you would have a little bit of an effect, right? So you have to take some of those things with a grain of salt whenever you're looking at those companion plants. What we focus more on when we're talking about vegetable gardening is interplanting and using the spaces well. So we had, your example, we should just let you have the microphone and teach the rest of the class. So interplanting, so where we grew the cucumbers and we grew them up and then we put the radishes and turnips around them, where we're using the space wisely. Interplanting is something that we can talk freely about, that we know, research shows that they work, they grow well, and it's an accepted production practice. But a lot of times when we get into those sort of like, things where we're fixing insect problems and stuff like that with other plants, there's not a lot of research to back them up. I have a question, and then I want one more group to share.
On ours, for our spring, I have like onions planted along the side of it. I grew up on a farm, I'm a grandpa's farmer, so it was onions. Rabbits don't like onions, a lot of wildlife don't like onions. So you put that kind of stuff on the perimeter of it, and then like the inside is where you put like your lettuce and stuff, because it's protected from wildlife.
I mean, you can find some stuff like that, because there are like wildlife preferences. You know, are they going to, in your 4x8 raised bed, are they going to like get to your onions here and then stop? Maybe, maybe not, but it could be good to try out. One more group to share.
Group wants to share.
Did I see a hand in the back? One more group, come on. Over here, there we go, this side of the room.
I don't know that we did anything extraordinary, but we were trying to get, the succession stuff that you talked about. So we've got a lot of spinach, lettuce, radish for the spring, and then use that bed for the tomatoes and peppers to succeed in the summer. We've got onions for both spring and summer, and then peas also for spring, and then as those, and then plant the cucumbers and squash, summer squash around them. And then as the peas, which are vertical, start to die off, you can pull them out, and you've got your vines. We've got beets and carrots for both spring and summer. And then we weren't quite sure in the fall. So when you go fall to winter, were you talking about you plant stuff in the fall and harvest it in the winter, basically?
Yeah, stuff that you can think about, will it survive through the winter or most of the way through the winter? Or things, so the one thing that I also throw into my vegetable garden rotation is garlic. Garlic.
We have that thanks to, Mary.
Right.
So it's a little over winter, so we planted that for fall into winter. Okay. And parsley also, will overwinter because it's a biennial. Yeah, but we didn't like plant our whole thing in the fall. We didn't plant everything.
Yeah. So the garlic, you plant that in September or October, you mulch it, it overwinters, it pops up in the next spring, and you harvest it in May or June, or whenever it will start to die back whenever you want to harvest it. So I add that into my rotation, so that takes like a fall into spring, and then I open it up, and then I can plant like late summer or fall crops when I pull my garlic up.
Hey, John, one thing too, I think, which we don't take into account, garlic is a beautiful perennial, just put in the perennial.
Yes.
And another one is oregano and basil. The bees love that for a pollinator. I mean, things that we take for granted that we eat, but can be also really nice. Oregano's not really a perennial, but it would fit into a perennial.
All right, some of those things we can fit into the perennial. So I don't typically plant a lot of herbs in my vegetable garden. I do basil because it's an annual, but a lot of them, if they're overwintered or if they're protected, they are more perennial, and you can add those more into the landscape, edible landscape, but they are great pollinator plants. You can think, I have lots of bees that love my basil.
And if ground is open over the winter, think of cover cropping too.
Right, cover cropping. We'll touch briefly on that.
I was gonna mention that I've been trying to do nothing but ground cover in my flower beds, so I don't have to mulch so much. And under my tree, I have thyme that I've had there for years. And the bees and the insects love it, and it just stays within there under the tree, and it looks nice, smells nice when I eat it.
Perfect. So these are some great examples. What are the other benefits of crop rotation? We actually can talk about it eliminates pressure from pests. It prevents exhausting soils. So what happens is different crops use different nutrients, especially the micronutrients, and even some of the macronutrients. If we think about garlic and corn, both of those are heavy nitrogen feeders. They like a lot of nitrogen. So I wouldn't want to plant those in the same place every year because we've always got to be really pumping the nitrogen to there. But what if I wanted to plant my garlic in the fall after I planted my beans for the summer? because the beans have bacteria on the roots that actually put nitrogen into the soil. We think about rotations that way as well. What can we pair up that puts things into the soil versus uses nutrients out of the soil? And so we think about some of those things. So nitrogen is the big one. So following those nitrogen producing crops like beans and peas with heavy nitrogen feeders, corn and garlic, stuff like that can be helpful. That's why a lot of farmers, when we're working with row crop farmers, we really push them at first to introduce like the soy, the beans, because then that adds nutrients in there. Because used to, it was, all corn all the time. And soy was actually introduced more as a way to introduce nitrogen as well as having a harvestable crop. Yes, ma'am.
I try to rotate crops that are bulb crops like beets and potatoes, and the next year plant a leaf crop like lettuce or even onions or something like that. Does that make sense in the completion of the soil?
So we were talking about planting different crop types. So root crops one year versus leaf crops versus fruiting. And that actually can have an effect because the different root types can really affect the soil structure. So those big root crops actually can help break up soil compaction. And you want to rotate those in every once in a while to uncompact the soil. Farmers, whenever they're doing a crop rotation, sometimes will work in daikon radishes when they're doing cover crops. The reason being is that, have you ever seen a daikon radish? They're not, this is not a daikon radish, like this is a daikon radish. Like they're huge. They call them tillage radishes because daikon is just too fancy.
So in a square by square garden, if I want to move things around, how far away from each other, when I'm planting, it's square by square.
That is one of the difficult things if you're a very small garden. What I do is I have a few raised beds, and so one raised bed is like one family group, and then that family doesn't rotate back for 4 years for that. Because I try to have multiple beds. If you have one bed, it becomes harder. So like alternating ends or alternating crops, like this year, I'm not going to grow this, I'll grow it again next year. You can think about things that you can do to rotate on small areas as well. 2 more questions, then we're going to go on. I got 15 minutes.
Okay, so to aid in crop rotation, when you do have a small vegetable bed, you might consider doing some container planting alongside it.
Right, adding some containers to do some rotation. One more.
Potatoes next to tomatoes.
They are the same family, and so they share a lot of the same diseases and pests. So you could plant them in the same area that year, but not plant them the next year in that same area. But you can get crossover of pests and diseases from those.
Which two plants did you just mention?
Tomatoes and potatoes. Sometimes you will have people say, I only garden organically. What does that mean? We're going to talk just briefly about what organic management means. It means that we're using all natural inputs, meaning that they come from a natural source. This is both for fertility and for pest management. There is sort of a myth out there, especially if you go to the grocery store and you buy organic produce. Has it been treated with pesticides?
Yes.
Yes. There is a myth out there that organic means no pesticide, and that is not the case. It may be the case in your garden, but it is not the case for everything. So whenever we're talking about organic management, we're combining effective IPM practices. So we try to avoid the problem to begin with. We try to treat the problem, and if we can't, then we use some sort of control mechanism. Organic pest control and organic fertility. Many gardeners practice organic techniques over concern of chemical inputs and human health. That is one of the reasons. However, study shows that organic produce does not necessarily mean that it is safer or better than commercial. A lot of research has looked at, if you use a pesticide on something, a non-organic pesticide, and follow the label rules, that there is not, the residue left on there is below what would be the threshold for health. And if you're buying produce that's organic, there have been pesticides that are organic pesticides that have been used on that. So it doesn't necessarily mean, organic doesn't necessarily mean pesticide-free. So that also means for your vegetable garden that if you have a recurring pest, insect, disease problem, that there are organic treatments for that. So that you don't have to continue to have the same problem. You can try to eliminate it or reduce it. I have seen gardens that, they're only organic, they don't spray anything, and they have insects or diseases running wild, and I call that organic by neglect. Basically, they're not taking care of the garden. I've seen that, and I had, before I moved here back in West Virginia, I think it was my very first year working for Extension. We had some weird weather where we had this weird cooling off early in the season, so everything was delayed. And just so happened, this was 2009, just so happened that the major suppliers of greenhouse grown tomato plants for farmers had an issue where all of the plants that they sold were infected with lake blight. And so I went to this farmer's field who proudly proclaimed to me that he was organic and never sprayed anything. And there was a field of 1,000 dead tomato plants because he had not managed anything in there. So that was organic by neglect. Lori.
Our local water also is not chemical free.
Right. Local water is not chemical free. In fact, one of the things that I hate the most about advertising is when people advertise something as chemical free. Because guess what? Nothing is chemical. Everything is made of chemicals. Water is a chemical. Air is a chemical. We are a bag of chemicals. Right? So I sort of got in trouble with the farmers market when they had a farm that they featured and posted and said that they were a chemical-free operation. And I made a comment and they got mad at me. Oh well.
MUD sterilizes the water.
Right, so there's sterilizers in the water, usually through some sort of chemical additive. And the water is a chemical.
So technically, if you're using a GMO seed or some kind of hybridized plant in your garden, that is a chemical induced situation, isn't it?
So that would be, the hybridized and GMOs, so that is different than like a chemical. So it can be similar in effect. So there are genetic engineered crops that have been engineered to manufacture an enzyme in the bacteria Bacillus thuringiensis, BT. You can buy BT. BT is a soil microbe. It's all around us. You breathe it all the time. You can purchase it and sprinkle it on your crops or spray it on your crops, and it kills caterpillar-like insects. It is totally inert to us. You can, if you eat a crop that has it on there, it has no effect. It gives the caterpillar a tummy ache. And it can't eat and it dies. They will engineer crops to create this chemical. So it does the same. And so, in effect, some of those things that we've engineered with the BT in it, you actually don't have to apply pesticides because it creates that one chemical that makes that caterpillar sick. And it's actually been found to be very helpful in a lot of foreign countries where they don't have laws that really help with safety around pesticide application. There have been a lot of farmer deaths and sickness in places like Pakistan and India. They grow a lot of eggplant, and eggplant has a lot of insect pests. And so you can see videos of farmers in Pakistan and India that have these backpack sprayers. They have this cloud of pesticide around them. They're not wearing any protective equipment. And there has been a BT eggplant that has been developed. So it produces that enzyme, that chemical in the eggplant, so they don't have to spray anymore. It's legal in Pakistan, and the farmer deaths from chemical exposure and also from suicides due to crop failure have way gone down. It is not legal in India to grow that, and so they're still having those problems. But we've got 10 minutes to talk about organic gardening. So fertility, we're going to manage our fertility with organic sources. So that means that you can't go out to the store and buy like the conventional fertilizer. There are prepared organic fertilizers that you can buy, like the biotone stuff, all that kind of stuff. If you look at the numbers, the fertilizer numbers are much lower, like the NPK, because they can't make them from those higher percentage sources. So you have to buy more of the fertilizer. And if you've ever bought that fertilizer, you will know that it's not cheap. There are other sources of fertility, like manures, like blood meal, bone meal, those types of things. You don't just want to apply those because you think you need them. You still need to do the soil test to figure out, do you need those? And we also use cover crops. So those cover crops can add in those nutrients, especially if we use legume cover crops, so like beans, or there's one called crimson clover. For a small garden, I would avoid using a perennial crop because then you have to figure out how to kill it if you're using a cover crop. A lot of times they can terminate a cover crop by spraying it. You might not want to do that in your home garden. Like if you were using like a white clover is a perennial, it will keep growing, so you have to figure out how to get rid of it. There are some general numbers. This is not for every manure, but this is like the average, the NPK numbers for manures. You'll notice that nitrogen is higher in poultry manure, up to 4 than the others, and also P and K. So those are higher in poultry manure. There's a little secret. If you didn't learn anything else today, you will learn that chickens do not urinate. So if you've ever seen chicken manure or bird poop, you'll notice that there's like a brown portion and a white portion. The white is actually the urea. So their urine is concentrated into urea and expelled. And so that is the urine from the chicken or from the bird. So the dark and the white. So that's why it's so much higher in nitrogen and other nutrients. If you use these, you still have to test to make sure. There's the other thing. I don't know if I got put into this. Oh yes, the next slide is the one that we really need to cover. Organic manure. They all have something in common. They all have microbes in them. That some of them are inert, some of them are good for the soil, some of them can make you sick. E. coli, salmonella, all of those kinds of things are found in manure. One of the things that I do when I talk to producers is I'm a certified produce food safety trainer. And this is something that we talk about when we talk about soil amendments of animal origin. If it comes from an animal, there's the potential for contamination. And a lot of home gardeners don't realize this. For producers, we have a recommended waiting period. It hasn't been cemented into law yet. They're still researching it. It could extend because they're finding it actually takes longer. But it really depends on what the crop is growing as to how long you should wait between applying the manure and harvesting the crop. I didn't say planting the crop, I said harvesting the crop. So when we get back to applying the manure, why applying it in the fall is a good idea. Not only does it percolate into the soil better, but it also gets us outside of this waiting period. If your crop is in contact with the soil, a root crop, lettuce, leafy greens, something that touches the soil, the minimum recommended waiting period for application of manure to harvest is 120 days. If you wanted to start a garden today and you went out and put manure on it, you would have to wait 120 days to harvest lettuce or leafy green from it. If it's a crop that doesn't come in contact with the soil, 90 days. So if you have your tomatoes and they're staked up, or if you have anything that's a fruit that doesn't touch the ground, you're fine at 90 days. They're actually researching this. We're expecting that this waiting period will increase for recommendations. So how do you control pests when you're organic? You rely heavily on IPM, trying to avoid the problem in the beginning. So some of the things I've talked about, planting hybrids that are disease resistant, a good way to avoid having to spray for those diseases. For farmers, the genetically engineered crops that keep the insects away actually reduce the amount they're spraying for insects. We do have some chemicals listed as organic. They are from natural sources. They're either mined from the ground or they come from some sort of natural source. And also attracting beneficial insects to the garden can help. So that means having a lot of flowers in the area, a lot of plant variety to attract good bugs that are predators to kill the bad bugs is one thing you can do. For those chemicals that we list as organic, there are some very common ones that we recommend all the time. For insects, you'll hear me recommend pyrethrum, which is a natural derivative from a chrysanthemum flower, pyrethrum. There are some chemicals, like you might hear copper sulfate for fungus. We want to tell people not to overuse that because it builds up in the soil. If it is a mineral, if you spray it on, it never goes away. It never breaks up. It can only wash away. Whereas if we apply like a more conventional chemical, it will actually break down over time. Mulching can also help with reducing weed pressure and also keeping our water and moisture good. What we can think about is I get people asking, well, what can I mulch with? And it really depends. So newspaper and straw are great. You can use wood chips, but here's the caveat. If you're always in there planting and moving stuff around and you get those soil chips, wood chips mixed in, what happens is they tie up nitrogen because they're decomposing. As long as it's on top of the soil, it's not a problem. But as soon as you get wood chips mixed into the soil, it ties up nitrogen and you'll see some nitrogen issues in your plant. So you can use whatever works for you. So we have some examples, straw, wood chips, leaves, those work well. We touched on cover crops and some of the benefits. I'm trying to move through here. And unfortunately, you had the slides. We are out of time. I know, we had such good time together. We had questions, we had an activity. What I want you to do, as you finish up, is to get out your electronic device again. And there will just be 2 questions. They will be private. It's just asking something. What was your aha moment? What did you learn today? And also, what will you do differently after today? And once you get those done, I believe you are free to go. Heck, you can go and do them while you're eating lunch. But that is all I have for you today.
Let's thank John for his presentation. And John raised a good point. It's always good to know what you're thinking because we just like to know that we're connecting. It's also good to know when future programs are planned and how we might modify them to best suit your needs. I know this from personal experience when doing the turf presentations and tree presentations, so that's really helpful. All right, so take a moment to fill out that Slido poll, and then we'll see you back here at about 5 or 10 minutes before 1 o'clock for our afternoon program. See you in a bit.
So I did my. I don't know, maybe that was the guy.
Mine at home are, and what I did is I didn't feel like I needed to be super thick. So I usually this, which is like 6 inches by an inch. Or I can get on plastic.
Some of these things in here seem out of line, like, I don't know, 16. Green, huh? That makes more sense. And only one corn. Put them in a row, like 2 to 3 inches apart.
In the fall, I personally wait
Really.
I like it.